Good morning and welcome to the webinar ASEAN+3 Growth Strategy in the Pandemic's Wake, organized by the ASEAN+3 Macroeconomic Research Office, or AMRO. My name is Glenn Van Zutphen and I will moderate today's session. Today's webinar is based on the second chapter of AMRO's flagship report, the ASEAN+3 Regional Economic Outlook 2022, also known as the AREO. Joining me in the studio today are Dr. Ho-E Kor, who is the chief economist at AMRO, and also Dr. Ling Hui Tan, AMRO's chief group head and lead economist for regional surveillance and co-author of this report as well. Joining us virtually from Taipei is Dr. Alicia Garcia-Herrero, chief economist for Asia Pacific at Nataxis, and from Jakarta is Dr. Muhammad Shatib Basri, former Minister of Finance of Indonesia and co-founder of Creco Consulting and Research. Now, at yesterday's launch of the report, we discussed the region's growth outlook, prospects, and challenges. Please visit AMRO's website to get a copy of that report. Follow the link or scan the QR code that you can see here. We've all been living with the COVID-19 pandemic for over 2 years. Today's webinar will focus on the impact of the pandemic on the medium to long-term growth in the ASEAN+3 region. Our panelists will discuss the nature and extent of economic scarring caused by the COVID-19 crisis, how the change in consumer behavior and how business models affect the region's growth strategy, as well as the region's opportunities and policy priorities. And we will ask your questions to our panelists as well. As you listen over the next few minutes, please start typing them in on the right side of window on your or on the slido.com. Hashtag that you can see here is AREO 2022. You can use this QR code as well. Before we hear insights from our speakers today, let's gather some of your thoughts through a quick poll. Please cast your vote in the window on the right side of your screen or the slido.com and enter the event code AREO 2022. Our poll question is this: what is the highest priority for sustainable long-term growth in your economy? Is it strengthening healthcare capacity, accelerating digitalization, improving the education system, upskilling and reskilling workers, or increasing market competition? Please register your answers and we'll talk about the results a little bit later. Just a reminder to keep sending in your questions for our panelists through the right side window or at that same Slido link and hashtag that we mentioned before. And now, I'd like to invite Ho-E Kor, the chief economist at AMRO, to give his presentation. Ho-E.
Thank you, Glenn. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on ASEAN+3 Growth Strategy in the Pandemic's Wake. This seminar is based on the thematic chapter of our flagship report, AREO 2022. The thematic chapter of our AREO report is normally devoted to studying structural challenges facing the region. Past AREO reports have reviewed key elements of the region's growth strategy, which involves member economies entering and moving up the global value chain, developing services as a second driver of growth and employment, and leveraging digital technology to enhance productivity and growth in the region. This year, we decided to focus on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the region. The pandemic has been a major disruptor, but also a catalyst for change. We decided to take a step back and ask ourselves whether our previous assessment of the region's strong growth prospects is still valid, and to reflect on the impact of the pandemic on the region's growth strategy going forward. We asked 3 broad questions. Has COVID damaged the region's long-run growth potential? How has the pandemic affected the region's prospects of developing services as a second engine of growth? Is the region's established manufacturing for export growth strategy still effective? We end with some key takeaways for the region as it embarks on its post-pandemic growth phase. Our first question is whether COVID-19 has damaged the region's long-run growth potential. How much scarring has the pandemic inflicted on the region, and how permanent is it? By scarring, we mean the extent to which the economy's growth potential will be affected through persistently lower output or lower growth rate. This chart shows the output trajectories of the ASEAN+3 economies compared with the pre-pandemic output trends. As you can see from the chart, the trajectory varies from economy to economy. For some economies, the trajectory converged back to its pre-pandemic trend, but for most, the trajectory moves in parallel with the trend, implying a permanent loss of output as a result of scarring. The pandemic is not over yet, even though some economies are already recovering. But obviously, the longer the pandemic stretches out, the greater the likelihood that the scarring will be more extensive and more permanent. Let me walk you through the various forms by which scarring could occur on labor, capital, and productivity. Let's start with labor supply. These three charts show the three different types of scarring: a reduction in the fertility rate, a reduction in the labor force participation rate, and a reduction in foreign workers. The left-hand side chart shows that fertility is below replacement rates for most countries in the region. The pandemic has exacerbated the trend as birth rates have declined across the region during the pandemic. The middle chart shows that labor force participation rates have declined across the region during the pandemic. Those are the dots that you can see, which are below the zero. So you see the largest decline for the Philippines, Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore, where the labor force participation rate dropped by about 1 to 3% compared with the 2019 average. Foreign workers are an important part of the labor force for many ASEAN+3 economies. During the pandemic, many foreign workers were repatriated. As a result, the labor force shrank quite significantly in some countries. The right-hand side chart shows that the share of foreign workers in Singapore fell from 38% of the labor force to 33% in 2020. This is true also in Malaysia and Thailand. These two charts show the scarring to human capital as a result of disruption in the education of the youth. In terms of human capital and labor productivity, scarring is likely to be felt most acutely in the lower income economies. The COVID-19 has caused an unprecedented disruption to education due to school closures. According to ADB, the number of lost instructional days in the region, 23%, is much greater than the global average. The left-hand side chart shows the extent of school closures in various countries. As you can see, Philippines, Myanmar, Malaysia, Cambodia have the highest, longest period of school closures in 2020 and 2021. The right-hand side chart shows that the learning losses tend to be greater for countries that can least afford it: Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, and the Philippines. On the positive side, a survey by the World Economic Forum suggests that ASEAN populations have increased the acquisition of digital skills during the pandemic. Turning to the capital stock, for ASEAN economies, the biggest concern is that the pandemic support and stimulus packages have consumed a lot of fiscal resources and reduced the fiscal space. This means that going forward, it will be harder for the governments to provide sufficient resources for public investment, especially in infrastructure. According to the World Bank, public-private investment commitments, which are mostly for infrastructure projects, have fallen off sharply, and you can see that on the left-hand side chart. This could delay the investment in infrastructure, especially in those economies with the largest infrastructure gaps. The right-hand side chart shows a ranking of the quality of infrastructure for regional economies. And as you can see, the ones with the largest infrastructure gaps are Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. Investment could also suffer if there's a scarring of corporate balance sheets when the pandemic support is withdrawn. The left-hand side chart shows corporate debt at risk has increased sharply across the region in 2020. That's the spike in the middle bar. But it appears to have moderated in 2021 with the improvement in earnings and amid an economic turnaround and lower interest rates. Total factor productivity could suffer if the pandemic affects business dynamism. Most economies provide financial support to firms that were suffering due to the pandemic. As a result, corporate failure rates have not spiked relative to pre-pandemic levels for most countries, and you can see that on the right-hand side chart. But prolonged regulatory forbearance could affect productivity too, and many zombie firms may emerge and become a drag on growth. Let's move to the second question. The services sector has borne the brunt of the COVID-19 lockdowns and other containment measures. On the other hand, the pandemic has inspired innovations in business models and a massive shift in digital technology. The travel and tourism industries in particular have been decimated, with the region's tourist arrivals plunging by 85% in 2020. And you can see that on the left-hand side chart. While countries in the region are reopening to foreign visitors, there are still no signs that China would do so soon. The recovery of tourism will likely be slow without the return of Chinese tourists. China is among the top 3 tourism source countries for the region. Fortunately, surveys suggest that Chinese tourists are keen to travel again within several months once China is able to relax its travel restrictions. And you can see that on the right-hand side chart. On the bright side, COVID-19 has boosted growth in digitally supplied services, including e-commerce, digital finance, telehealth, and modern services. The left-hand side chart shows the phenomenal growth in e-commerce. E-commerce retail sales in major ASEAN countries grew by almost 50% from 2019 to 2021 and are expected to grow further. Looking forward, the outlook for e-commerce in the region's economies is positive, even after COVID-19 crisis. Survey evidence shows that digital consumption has become a way of life in the region. As shown in the right-hand side chart, survey data from large ASEAN economies show that more than 90% of new digital consumers in 2020 continued to engage in online consumption in 2021 because of the convenience and integration of digital services into their daily life. As shown in the left-hand side chart, survey evidence suggests that digital merchants are very likely to continue or increase their usage of digital payments. Digital health, telemedicine, telehealth, health tech also received a big boost during the pandemic. The right-hand side chart shows that investment deals in the health tech industry have grown rapidly. The left-hand side chart shows the exports of modern and traditional services. The 2 economies in the region that benefited from modern services export during the pandemic are the Philippines, and because of the BPO services, and Singapore. Economies like Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia relied more on traditional services like travel and tourism. The right-hand side chart shows the exports of various types of services. Exports of modern services, the dark blue line, grew more robustly during COVID-19 compared to other segments, whereas exports of traditional services, especially travel, continue to be far below their pre-pandemic levels. This has highlighted the importance of modern services in diversifying the economy's service exports in the face of continued headwinds against traditional services. We now come to the third question. The pandemic has resulted in severe supply chain disruptions, which has led to calls for a restructuring of the global supply chain, particularly onshoring or nearshoring of production of critical products. Some observers have interpreted this as the end of globalization and a retreat into greater self-sufficiency. What does this imply for the region's long-standing manufacturing for export growth strategy? Is it still effective? What can be done to shore up the strategy? Even before the pandemic, it was recognized that manufacturing for export strategy would face increasing challenges. In particular, political populist pressures have been rising in the US and Europe to reshore global supply chain and bring jobs back home. The pandemic has added fuel to the movement's widespread supply chain disruption, including of critical products such as medical supplies and semiconductors. They have highlighted the drawbacks of long and complex supply chains and renewed interest in reshoring supply and production networks. Last year's thematic chapter concluded that the evidence so far did not point to wholesale reshoring or nearshoring of manufacturing capacity out of China or the rest of the ASEAN+3, although a reconfiguration could be expected in the future. The most recent survey data in 2021 suggests that reshoring and nearshoring intentions, if not activities, have gained more traction globally. The map you see in front of you shows reports of reshoring or nearshoring from the US, EU, China, Japan, and Korea. Ultimately, the decision by key global value chain players will depend on factors such as cost efficiencies, policy incentive, and supply chain resilience. The likelihood that a significant share of global value chain will be moved away from the ASEAN+3 region is low because of the highly efficient and cost-effective manufacturing ecosystem in the region. In addition, the ASEAN+3 region has also become a huge consumer market that has become a magnet for FDIs to move into the region. RCEP holds promises for promoting and keeping supply chains in the region. Through RCEP, multinational enterprises will be able to use the comparative advantages of different production bases in the ASEAN+3 to meet demand in the region and beyond. Areas of note are as follows: tariff reduction, which benefits the +3 countries; consolidated rule book, which applies to trade among all 15 members; more accommodating rules of origin, which the members adopt one single set of rules of origin with regional value content of no less than 40%, while the accumulation rule allows goods originating from one member state that can be used as inputs in the production of new product in a second member state to be considered as originating from the second member state. Services trade liberalization, labor mobility, e-commerce and digital trade, acknowledging the validity of electronic signatures, enacting regulation in the protection of personal data, and protection of e-commerce users from fraud and misleading practices. Nearshoring within the ASEAN region is an attractive option for multinational enterprises located in the +3 as a way to build supply chain resilience. Multinationals would benefit from locating its high-end manufacturing in +3 while moving lower-end products to the ASEAN region. To summarize, here are our key messages. Some extent of scarring is unavoidable. For example, disruption to education, lower fertility rate, lower labor force participation rate, or reduction in foreign workers. There's also been a reduction in fiscal space, and we are concerned that it could constrain infrastructure investment. And there's also the risk of emergence of zombie firms. Travel and tourism industries have been badly battered and will take time to recover. However, shift to digital technology should lead to productivity gains and the emergence of new growth drivers, such as e-commerce, digital finance, telemedicine, and other digital services. The importance of strengthening regional integration to counter protectionism, promote intra-regional trade, and enhance the resilience of the global supply chain. Let me stop here. Thank you. Back to you, Glenn.
Hui, thank you very much for your report presentation today. We appreciate that. A short while ago, we asked for your views on the highest priority for sustainable growth in your economy. Let's see how you voted. Well, by far, upskilling and reskilling workers came in at 36%. Accelerating digitalization, not too far behind, 30%. Strengthening healthcare capacity and increasing market competition were even at 13. And at the bottom of the list, improving education in your particular regions as well. Thank you all for contributing to that poll. And now that we've listened to Hui's presentation on the region's growth and strategy, let's check in with Alicia and Shatib on their thoughts about the presentation. Alicia, let's start with you in Taipei.
Thank you, Glenn. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to first congratulate the authors of the report because it's just an amazing piece of research. I can't think of a better way to describe the future of Asian economies, ASEAN+3, in the light of COVID and, by the way, additional shocks that we are experiencing. One is obviously the war in Ukraine, but also climate change. So what I want to say here is that as regards scarring, we need to realize that as those scars are now being hit by additional shocks, war and climate change. So this means that those countries that I fully agree with Dr. Kaur, that basically the lower your income, the hardest hit you are in terms of that scarring, those happen to be as also possibly weaker, especially in the light of climate change. So in other words, it's going to be a shock after shock. And therefore, I think countries need to take their bets. So countries that might not be very well placed for manufacturing will need to bet on digital services. And this is one of the key messages of the report. I want to highlight it. Not everybody will be able to compete in this nearshoring, let alone reshoring trend. We can see very clearly that India seems to be already quite a winner. We had announcements by Google, by Apple. Countries that are small or too small to compete in this search for nearshoring need to think services. And that means that the type of infrastructure you will need, given your limited fiscal resources, will be different. So I want to highlight the need for broadband infrastructure. That's something that I think needs to be stepped up in the region. We are actually making a proposal to the G20, Bruegel, the think tank I'm affiliated with, exactly to foster and do more on telecom and especially broadband infrastructure. So I think digital services are a solution, especially for the countries that can't compete on the nearshoring because of the labor force characteristics, maybe too small, maybe education-wise, maybe the infrastructure, you name it. So that's one thing. Another comment I want to make is that the fiscal space needs to be there for green energy and climate change mitigation, because there will be no nearshoring possible, in my view, or at least easy enough without that. So think of something that is coming, and it might come well be beyond Europe, which is the carbon adjustment mechanism. And this means that if your production of energy is carbon intensive, there will be taxes imposed on your exports. So this is a priority to really basically change that into green energy as beyond the preferences you just showed. There was no choice for spending in green energy. I think it's going to be extremely important, let alone climate mitigation, to reduce the impact of climate change on manufacturing. So that's for the nearshoring part. And I want to end by saying that you also need e-government. We talked about e-commerce. That's great if you have the consumption ability, if you have the revenue, if you have the disposable income. But you also need to have an efficient government, a digital government in the light of climate change. There may be new pandemics. We need to be resilient to a country working properly in the light of all of those shocks. And I think spending in e-government is absolutely crucial as well. So I hope I've been clear and I've exhausted my time. Thank you. Thank you. Back to you, Glenn.
Thank you, Alicia. You've given us a lot to think about and wrapped up a lot of issues that I think are on the minds of many people across the region. So thank you for articulating those. Shatib, let's go to you in Jakarta. What do you feel are some of the key points that you heard from Hoi's remarks?
Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate OE and the team for the very good and excellent report. The only problem that I have with this report is I don't have a major comment to make because I agree very much with this report. But let me give some comments to enhance the discussion. First, the first issue that perhaps that we can discuss later on is what will be the implication of this pandemic in the future? What will make this pandemic, make a policy will be different pre and the post pandemic. The first one is, in my view, the authors mentioned also in this report, is a typical of the fiscal policy who he mentioned in his remarks regarding the impact of the scarring effect. And I think the implication of this situation is the future fiscal policy or government policy in Asia will move more into inclusive growth. Yeah, because there is a risk of possibility of the K-shaped recovery, rising inequality, who he also mentioned about the risk of the setback the quality of the human capital because closure of school, maybe an impact on the woman participation because many of them work in the informal sector. So definitely inclusive growth will be the future design of the fiscal policy in Asia. But the question is, this is related to what Alicia said. What happened, whether the fiscal space is available or not. So in this particular issue, the fiscal space become a very important issue. And at the same time, as Alicia mentioned, there is a need for the government to support for the climate change as well. So what the government can do in this kind of situation? I refer to some Asian countries, including Indonesia. Maybe there is a possibility that the government try to look at to explore what I call the triple win policy, because many countries in Asia, government in Asia needs some funding to support this inclusive growth and also the climate change. And one of the potential revenue or expenditure, allocation that they can get is perhaps to reduce the fossil fuel subsidy. I call this policy as a triple win because it will reduce the demand for fossil fuel. And we can use this money to support the investment on the public health, on the inclusive growth. And this is good for macro. So that's my first comment regarding this, the impact of this pandemic to the scarring effect. The second issue that I would like to raise is about the digitalization. I agree very much with the report about the importance of this digitalization. And I think the good thing, one thing that we learned from this pandemic is countries or people who can survive during the pandemic was the one who can transform themselves into digital. Because if we back to the very conceptual basic of economics, the essence of economics is about transaction. And then transaction happen if market exists. And by definition, market is a place where people can exchange goods and services, virtually or physically. But because of the pandemic, we were not allowed to exchange the good physically. That's the reason why the sectors that who can transform themselves into digital will survive. And that's also explained why the tourism, for example, will be lag behind, because there is no way the user experience can be substituted into digital. Yeah, so this is something very important because this pandemic expedite the digital transformation. But the problem is there is a risk of the digital divide in many countries in ASEAN, yeah, because the limited infrastructure. So Alicia point regarding the investment on the infrastructure is also very important. The other thing related to digital issue is about the ability of the government to catch up. Yeah, I'm not too worried so much about the industrial 4.0, but my concern is about government 4.0, whether the regulators will be able to catch up with the innovation. The third point that I would like to make is about the supply chain. I think the pandemic will change the pattern of trade in Asia. One thing that we learned from the pandemic is don't put all your eggs in one basket. So we will see the possibility of diversification of the production base, in which maybe some ASEAN countries will take the benefit of it. That's the first one. The second one, perhaps we will see, the importance of technology, because one thing that we learned from the pandemic is somehow we need to rely on technology, because once there is a supply chain disruption, there is a risk that our production will be interrupted because of that. So the role of technology become very important. The third part is maybe we will see the new pattern of the pattern of stock, not just in time again, but just in case. So maybe some companies will hold more inventory than before. This makes the production costs become more expensive. And the other thing is, of course, you cannot rely on one particular country. You have to diversify. Uh, Last but not least, about on my comments, there are several issues that this report does not discuss, but I can understand, maybe because it's sensitive, but I think it is very important to discuss about this issue. The first one is the geopolitical issue. I think it is very difficult nowadays not to touch the geopolitical issue, the geopolitical tension, because somehow this will affect the issue of the trade, this will affect the coordination. We desperately need global cooperation, unfortunately, under the situation when the geopolitical tension is happening. So the question is, how does this policymaker, design this policy under this geopolitical tension? The second one is about the state capacity, because one thing that we learned from the pandemic, the pandemic revealed the weak capacity of states. Yeah, the ability of the government to address the pandemic in a very, efficient way. The coordination, the issue of the investment in public health. But in sum, I would say that this is a great report, and congratulations to Hoi and all the team members. Back to you, Glenn.
Shatib, thank you so much for that overview. And let's go now to some questions with our panel. Hoi, Shatib and Alicia have listed an amazing array of challenges, not only for ASEAN+3, but globally. But looking a little bit closer to home, where do you think we will see, or how bad do you think we will see the scarring effects in this region, given all that we've just heard?
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. Indeed, scarring is a major concern that we have. That's why we focus the study on the scarring in the region. But when the pandemic first hit, we were really worried about the scarring in the region. But looking back over these last 2 years, I think the scarring has not been as bad as we had feared. And this is mainly due to 3 reasons. First, the very massive and comprehensive fiscal and financial support that regional governments provide to support the economy, businesses, households, to prevent the liquidity squeeze and prevent the impairment of the balance sheets of the businesses. And that is very important because this is a liquidity shock, and it's important to make sure that sufficient liquidity or income is provided so that the business will be able to survive this liquidity shock. So as a result, I think if you look at the balance sheet of corporate, there have been failures and all that, but by and large, most of the corporates are still alive and doing well. And the banks actually have been reporting record profit last year. The second factor is digital technology, I think this was mentioned also by Chatib and Alicia. And digital technology has made a huge difference in the way it has overcome some of the disruption imposed by the pandemic and the containment measures. A good example, of course, is working from home. Without that, with video technology, we were able to conduct business as usual, and this has helped overcome the problem of being locked down. And actually, looking at our own experience, we probably were more productive working from home than when we were going to the office, simply because we saved the commuting time. So digital technology is very important, and we saw that also in e-commerce, in telehealth, when doctors are not able, and patients are not able to come to the office, they're able to offer services through telehealth. So digital technology has played an important role in supporting production and demand, I would say. And this has reduced the scarring across the region. And of course, the third important factor is vaccine. We were very fortunate that effective vaccines were developed towards the end of 2020, and we were able to ramp up the vaccination rate across the region. And this has helped to protect the population and allow them to open up. Without vaccine, I think we will still be fairly restrictive in terms of containment policies, and that would, as a result, there will incur more scarring across the region. So for those three reasons, the scarring has not been as bad. Of course, we have identified in my presentation that there have been scarring to education and healthcare and other sectors of the economy. But let me stop here.
Okay, thank you, Hui. Let's talk now, Chatib and Alicia. We received a question from the Straits Times saying the ADB last week said Indonesia's GDP is growing too slowly to reach its goal of becoming a high-income economy by the year 2045, and it appears that similar targets around the region will also be missed, including those in Thailand and Malaysia. To what extent is COVID to blame, and are long-term targets like these even useful in a world where the pandemic and war and domestic politics can wreak havoc on the best intentions? Chatib, let's start with you and thinking about Indonesia in relation to this question.
Well, I think this is a very good question. First of all, I think my answer is both pandemic and also our productivity constraint will affect our ability to achieve relatively high growth. Let me give an example. Yeah, our incremental capital output ratio is around almost 6 to 7% now. So if we want to grow by 7%, we probably need about investment over GDP is around 42%. But our domestic saving is limited; it's only 34%. So I think the only way, if we want to increase our growth, is to enhance the productivity. So productivity is the key issue. When you're talking about productivity, then investment on the human capital is very important in technology, governance, and infrastructure. On the second point, I agree that the pandemic also affected the potential growth, as we discussed. We don't know yet. As of today, Indonesian economic growth has back to the pre-pandemic, but we don't know yet what will be the impact of this quality of human capital, because it's been 2 years. Students, not attended or come to school. What will be the quality of the labor market in the future? That will be the big issue. So under this kind of situation, I do believe that every country in Asia, including Indonesia, need to catch up. That is why the role of this, investment, both private investment and public investment are very important. And in related to that, it of course, also how to improve the productivity. That will be the key.
All right, thank you, Chatib. Alicia, over to you. It's a multi-part question that we received from the Straits Times, but in general, what do you think about this idea of long-range targets? Are they even worth it when we've got so many other geopolitical and health concerns happening throughout the world and of course, in the ASEAN+3 region?
I actually think that all of these targets should be seen as what you envision rather than what you target. And I think it does help set up long-term plans for a country, but I don't think the number is really what we should be focusing on, because it's all relative. Maybe you achieve a certain amount of dollar per capita, but that might be too low if others do much better than you. I don't think it's very is a good way to focus on the growth target or on escaping the middle income cap, etc., but rather the policies needed to do better. And there, what I want to add, beyond what Shatrip just said, which I think is, I fully agree with his comments, is that um, we need to think of a region here that might be on the move. Let me clarify. Again, I want to focus on climate change because even the pandemic, we have to think of a region in the midst of a geopolitical cliff. I fully agree again with Chatter, which needs to navigate that, needs to navigate climate change, and needs to navigate potential new pandemics, because we don't know whether we are really over with this one, or whether there will be additional waves. So what do you need? And where do you put the money? I think education is key. I'm sorry about the poll, but I think education is key. But perhaps the education and upskilling, reskilling should come together, because it's about educating everybody to work differently. And again, there I want to insist, you need the right broadband, you need the means, you need the e-governments to be able to do that, not only private education but public education. And I want to just note the fact that there is a long way to go in Asia. If we look at World Bank education rankings, uh, you can see, that there are things there, some of which have been actually already highlighted. I can think of China, Scott Rosell. We think of China as, of course, great human capital, talent, and so on. But you need to look at the mass of the population, and Scott Rosell makes this point in Invisible China, which I highly recommend. That literally 70% of the labor force has not gone to high school in China. So imagine the rest. So I think that's essential in a world moved by robotization and AI. You need skilled workers so that pass and do better than the robots and do better than AI. Therefore, I think it's extremely important, and digitalization can only help. So we need to take this challenge in Asia for those growth targets to come true at some point. Yeah.
Thank you, Alicia. And Ling Hui, if we can come to you now. I know a lot of us are very interested to hear your thoughts on this previous question about the ASEAN+3 countries that might be more affected by scarring than some of the other ones. How do you feel about that?
Okay, well, thanks, Glenn. That's a good question. When we were writing this chapter, we looked into the extent of scarring in previous major crises, like the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis. And of course, a pandemic is a very different type of crisis than a banking or currency crisis. But generally speaking, there are maybe two broad sets of factors that we can think of that would affect the extent of scarring. First would be initial conditions. So in some cases, the pandemic reinforced negative trends that were already in place. So, for example, in some economies, the declining trend in domestic labor force growth was already a concern in some places like Japan, in Korea, in Singapore, and COVID just made it worse, basically. In other cases, initial conditions maybe made it a little bit more difficult or more challenging for the economy to adapt and bounce back from the pandemic. For example, economies like Cambodia and Thailand were heavily dependent on tourism. And as we know, that was the sector that took the biggest hit. In other economies like Laos and Myanmar, they were further behind in digital infrastructure competitiveness, and that made it more difficult for them to catch up or adapt to things like remote schooling and online consumption. The other set of factors would be policy responses. Generally, as we know, the economies that were able to quickly vaccinate the majority of their population and keep their healthcare system from becoming overwhelmed, they generally had less likelihood of suffering long-lasting damage to their labor force. Economies that had sufficient policy space to provide financial and other support to firms and households generally had less deep and shorter recessions. But there's a tricky balance here because prolonged support can also contribute to scarring, right, by creating this problem of zombie firms, which are firms that are unable to cover their debt servicing costs out of their current profits for an extended period of time. And having too many of these zombie firms becomes a drag on growth because they trap resources in the economy that could otherwise be allocated to new and more productive firms. So we haven't seen this yet, but it is something that the region's policymakers obviously need to keep in mind. Sometimes, in order to limit or minimize this type of scarring, it may be necessary to let some businesses close so that resources in the economy can be reallocated to new engines of growth. So I'm going to stop here, Glenn.
Great. Thank you so much, Ling Hui. And before we carry on with our next question, a quick reminder for those of you out in the audience, please do submit your questions on the right-hand side of the screen, also using the Slido link that we gave you just a bit earlier. Another question coming in from the Straits Times: what are the policy fixes to boost economic growth? Alicia, let's start with you in Taipei. What can countries do to minimize the effects of scarring from a policy perspective?
Well, I think we've gone through most of it, but I would argue that each country needs to have a vision that is clearly different and makes that country have a comparative advantage. So, if I'm Singapore, it's clearly digital services. I need to go for that because that's my size. I need to rely on globalization. If there's no globalization of like much less in terms of people to people movement, I need to do something to avoid that. So I think each country needs to find what's my niche. If I'm a low income economy, if I'm Cambodia, and I know that tourists will not come as, in my opinion, tourism is not going to go back to what it was because restrictions of traveling, and I think that's very important to mention. The geopolitics behind what we've seen so far will make traveling for pleasure less obvious because people have by now gotten used to it because there won't be any interest for so much traveling from government perspective. So if you depend on something that is no longer going to be there as clearly, people will travel for maybe for education for longer periods. You need to adapt your business model, yeah, and you need to think, okay, what can I offer? Maybe I don't have the infrastructure for digital services, nor do I have the labor force, but maybe my size is big enough to offer a good deal for nearshoring. So I need to focus on the infrastructure for nearshore. I can't do all. So I think for each country, that policy vision needs to be there. And frankly, it's not about 2050, it's not about 2040, it's about now. Because that's when everybody's exiting and everybody needs to find its own place. So yeah, I think it's important to come up with strategies on this one and think of a world that will be different, where movement, whether it's financial flows, whether it's human, people to people movement, exchanges, will be different than before. So we need to change our mindset, and I think every policymaker needs to go through this at this point.
Thank you, Alicia. Shatib, as Alicia just mentioned, it's not a one-size-fits-all policy fix. But from your perspective, are there certain things that could be done to boost economic growth from the governmental policy perspective?
Thanks. First of all, I think I mentioned in my remarks the future of the government policy in the future. The first one is we'll go more into inclusive growth, yeah, because the scarring effect, etc. So in this particular issue, I think it is very important to design the fiscal policy to ensure that they will provide an access for health, for education, for the human capital. So basically, investment in the human capital is a very important one. But we do understand that the role of governments become very important because of that. But we need to make sure that the government spending is in the a good quality. So we are talking not only of the need of the fiscal expansion, but how to improve the quality of spending. Yeah, we are not talking about the increase of the size of the budget deficit, but to make sure that every cent that we spend, will create an outcome that we would like to have. That's the first one. The second one, I also mentioned about the importance of the digitalization. So that is why the investment on this, infrastructure digital is also very important. Number three is about we have to take the benefit of this regional cooperation. Yeah, because I don't think that any country in the world could afford to be an autarky, even though there is a risk of the supply disruption. But we have to be very realistic as well. Under this kind of situation, there is a risk of the creeping protectionism. I don't think the unilateral reform relatively easy nowadays because many countries in the world, yeah, one of the reaction towards this pandemic is economic nationalism, is pushback towards globalization. So the question is, what will be more feasible on this? Maybe not unilateral reform. Of course, I would like to pursue for the multilateral, but the prospect of multilateral is still not clear. So one of the possible, the maybe a second best solution is regional cooperation. But if you're talking about regional cooperation, we have to find a way in which we find a common platform in which country will agree to work together. If you start with some issue that many countries have different view, it's very difficult. And one of the potential issue that maybe we can work together is capacity building or issue of health. So perhaps that's some of the issues that we can lay out to increase or to boost the economic growth for the future. Back to you.
Thanks, Shati. Yes, the notion of regional cooperation obviously is a very important one. Perhaps we can touch on that a bit later, but for now, let's talk about something that we've all experienced, which is digitalization and the use of technology over the past couple of years. And Hoey, let's start off with you and talking a little bit about how ASEAN+3 economies can make use of digitalization to offset some of those pandemic scars that we've been talking about and hopefully maximize their growth potential. What do you think?
Well, I think I already mentioned in my earlier remarks how digitalization has helped the countries to overcome the disruption by the supply chain. Digitalization is a trend that's been ongoing for some time before the pandemic hit. And I think one of the positive things about the pandemic is that it's made authorities realize how important digitalization is. And I think now, if you look around the region, every country is putting into place some kind of a program or plan to ramp up digitalization of their economies. Even a country like Japan, they were forced to, for instance, digitalize the signature because otherwise most of the documents cannot be sealed. So, I mean, digitalization, in a very broad sense, is a fourth industrial revolution. It covers artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, blockchain, data analytics, and so on. And I think what we have come to realize is that if we're going to have an improvement in productivity, we really need to leverage on digitalization. And digitalization will also help us to address some of the issues of climate change. I think that was mentioned by Chatip and also by Alicia. And I think there was one day during the pandemic when the sky turns blue everywhere in the world, and it was just amazing, right? So digitalization allows us to overcome physical distances and allows us to save on fuel, and that's very important. And automation is also very important, and I think that's one reason why there's been less scarring, because many in Singapore, for one thing, we have suffered a big decline in the foreign workers. And the authorities came out with all kinds of apps to try to automate and save on labor. Of course, it's not a perfect replacement. And when you go to a restaurant, you'd rather be served by someone real rather than a robot. But still, it makes a big difference that at least the restaurant is able to operate and provide the services that's necessary. But for all this to work, I think it's very important to realize that we need to ramp up the digital infrastructure. And many countries, the infrastructure is still not good enough. This is a digital divide, I think, that we're talking about across countries and within countries as well. So we need to improve the internet services, broadband, 5G, and now 6G is coming along the way. So we need to, but we also need to improve the regulatory structure to facilitate the cross-border provision of services. And I think this is, again, something that is, many authorities have come to realize, and they're working together, for instance, to create cross-border payments between countries. So this is a trend, I think, that's very important, and it's going to help boost the productivity of the region.
All right, thank you, Hoi. Shatib, let's ask you about that. Do you think ASEAN economies like Indonesia are doing enough to take advantage of digitalization as a potential growth driver?
Well, my response is the potential is there, Glenn. If you notice that many of the unicorn companies are based in Indonesia because the huge market. Yeah, so I'm not too worried so much about the ability of the companies to to take the benefit of it. And definitely Indonesia need to go into that direction, exactly like Hui said. But let me raise my concern, and this is not only unique to Indonesia, and I don't have the answer to this. My concern is more on the government 4.0, whether the regulators will be able to catch up. Can you let me give an example? Yeah, with this kind of the digital disruption, the product cycle is getting shorter, and then most every I don't know every 6 months or a year that the government need to change the regulation because it's no longer relevant, it's obsolete. Then the question is, can the government change the regulation almost every 6 months because of the disruption? What we need is an agile bureaucracy. But Glenn, unfortunately, agile bureaucracy is an oxymoron. There is no way the bureaucracy can be agile. And I think this is really the challenge of many governments all over the world regarding this digitalization. Because what we need is change of mindset from agree on rules to agree on principle. So back to you, Glenn.
Thank you, Shatib. Change of mindset. Alicia, when we think about that, what lessons can ASEAN learn about digitalization and its benefits from the +3 members?
Well, I like to argue that, of course, I mean, digitalization, especially in China, but also South Korea, even more than Japan, is a great success, and there's no doubt about it. But we also need to learn about what those experiences may show to the rest of the world, certainly the rest of Asia, in terms of what might be missing. Missing for them, missing for everybody else, missing for the US, missing for Europe, and certainly missing in the rest of Asia because they are, in a way, building upon what is already in existence. And I like to go to 3 points: data sovereignty. So if you are a small country and everybody starts, basically um, keeping its data for themselves, and the issue of data transfer becomes balkanized, as we're seeing already, smaller countries will have no chance to really compete in this data driven world. So that's one thing I like to highlight, that we need norms, we need rules of law on data sovereignty. The other is regulation. So, of course, government, e-government, regulation of the digital world is key, and Chatrip has already covered that. So I want to focus on one specific point, which is crypto regulation. And I'm sure you realize that there's been a sea change in the US, in Europe, as a consequence of Ukraine, as to the need to clearly regulate crypto much faster than we would have thought otherwise. Now, the thing is, this can't be just an issue of the West or an issue of the East or an issue, it's like this is a global issue. So again, I want to go back to what Chatrip said, that we are in, most of the issues we have are global, but the solutions are local. So the smaller you are, the more you're going to be forced to kind of not not being able to come up with your own solution because you depend on the others. And I think that's where we are. And the last one is the tax base. So everything we've been saying so far is we need more government, we need more education, we need more digital infrastructure. I mentioned the broadband as a key, but we don't have the tax base needed. We didn't have it before. We all know that Asia is, even China, by the way, the effective tax ratio has been coming down very aggressively, and it is an issue. But on that note, the issue is that digitalization is going to make it even harder to control your tax base. And I think that is very important. We need to come up with a solution so that, in my humble opinion, the tax base, the minimum tax base, and there's been, of course, efforts at the G20 level on corporate tax. But I have to say, it's beyond that. I mean, it's even for individuals. We need, to me, I wouldn't say very high, but at least slightly higher and certainly comparable across the board tax base that we can work on, because we need the government to do things that are absolutely indispensable: broadband, education, resilience to climate change and new pandemics. All of that requires money, and digitalization may make it even harder. So I just want to highlight these three challenges. Thank you. Back to you, Glenn.
Thanks, Alicia. Those are big challenges indeed. And Ling Hui, we've always had a digital divide across ASEAN+3. Do you think that the last couple of years of the pandemic has heightened that, has made it even greater between some countries?
In some ways. So let me explain. The digital divide, normally we think of it as uneven distribution of access to and use of digital technology. And this divide can be across countries, or it can be within a given country. Uneven access to digital technology, I think, is mostly an infrastructure investment challenge. As we know, in the last 2+ years, the ASEAN+3 economies have had to divert a lot of their fiscal resources to dealing with the pandemic and the recession. And this means that the economies that were less digitally competitive to begin with will now have less resources to spend on closing this gap. On the other hand, the economies that had more fiscal space, digitalization, as we've just heard, has pretty much moved to the top of the priority in everyone's agenda, and so they have a greater impetus now to close that gap. On the use of digital technology, well, we all know that the pandemic has accelerated this use of digital technology across the ASEAN+3. It has forced people to learn how to do a lot of things online, right? Like go to school, work, buy and sell, go to the bank, consult a doctor, and so forth. And this learning has been persistent. So before the pandemic, online shopping and digital payments were maybe very common only in a few economies like China, Korea, Singapore. But now they've become a way of life across the ASEAN+3. And so that's a good thing. And at the same time, I guess, because of the shift to digital technology across different aspects of life, correspondingly, digitalization skills acquisition and training has also now jumped to the top of the priority in policymakers' agendas. But it's not going to be easy, as Shatip and Alicia pointed out. There are a lot of challenges. Government is one thing, but another example, as we mentioned just now, is schooling. As we know, the pandemic led to school closures, prolonged school closures across the world. And in the ASEAN+3, actually, the ASEAN+3 economies actually rank quite highly in terms of number of students that have internet access at home, especially in the urban areas. But still, the quality of the remote learning has been generally poor, except again, in more digitally advanced economies like China, Korea, and Singapore that could build on their previous investments in digital learning systems and content. So as we showed, or as Hui showed just now, the learning losses within ASEAN+3 are going to be larger in the economies that have less human capital to begin with. And that's not going to bode well for closing the digital divide in the future. So overall, I would say that the pandemic has exposed digital inequalities across countries, advanced versus less advanced, and within countries, rural versus urban areas. But more generally, it has also exposed social inequalities across sectors, close contact sectors versus remote-ready sectors, across occupations, teleworkable or white-collar versus non-teleworkable or blue-collar, across income groups, genders, and so on. But that's a broader issue, so I'm going to stop here and let the others weigh in.
Yeah, indeed it is. Thanks, Ling Hui. And your question that you've just answered also addresses the live questions that we had coming in from the Ministry of Agriculture and Food and Industries in Malaysia and the CEU in the Philippines. So we hope that has addressed their question as well. Shatib and Alicia, as Ling Hui just mentioned, social disparities is one of the topics that we have not really specifically honed in on yet. Let's do that now. More broadly, has the pandemic widened some of those social gaps? And what policies can government look at or private sector look at to help take away some of those disparities? What do those policy decisions look like to you, Alicia?
Well, I do think that disparities have increased across the board, and there is a reason for this. If you look at official unemployment ratios, this is China, but this is beyond China. They look okay because, basically it was even hard, and this is true across the globe, it was not easy to lay off people who were officially employed for a number of reasons. You were getting subsidies, you were, a number of. But for those who are in gray sectors or or unofficially employed in a way or another, the situation has worsened dramatically. So we need to do indeed much more inclusive policies to reduce this gap and reduce income inequality in the region. This is true across the board. China is taking, its vision of common prosperity. Even for that matter, Kishida, before the elections kind of went through that, because even in Japan, this is a reality. So what can we do? For countries of a lower income, I think inclusive finance is important because a lot of what's happening is lack of access to credit, and it will go all the way even to China. And these are some of the policies that are being looked into. But I think beyond that, you really need to think of maybe this is my European mindset. Sorry about that, but I do think the welfare state, if it's not exaggerated, and I can agree that I think Europe is, but there's a long way to go from the European standard to what we have in Asia. I think by now, in the era of robotization, international artificial intelligence, we need to realize that some people will be out of the labor market, and beyond retraining and upskilling and everything you want to do, some will be left there, and we need to find ways to integrate these people. So I do think that we need a targeted welfare state of some sort to make sure that there is a minimum income available for inclusive or a more inclusive society. That's all from my side. Back to you, Glenn.
Thanks, Elisa. Shatib, from your perspective, do you see that some of these social disparities have been deepened across the pandemic, or have they always been there, but now we're just seeing them more?
I agree very much with what Alicia said, because as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, there is a risk of the K-shaped recovery. Unfortunately, not all Asian countries has the capability like Singapore. They can provide like a paycheck for majority of the population. But one thing that we learned from the pandemic, we asked people to stay at home to avoid the pandemic because the lockdown, right? So for the middle and upper income class, they have savings. They could afford to stay at home. But what about for people who doesn't have savings? If you ask to stay at home, then they're gonna lose their income. So that's the reason why the risk of the K-shaped recovery is there for a country like Indonesia, in Philippines, in Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand, in which that fiscal space is limited, they cannot give a sort of like a paycheck or the cash transfer for the whole population. Yeah, that's the first one. The second one, I also mentioned about the companies or people who can survive during the pandemic was the one who can transform themselves into the digital. But unfortunately, because the digital divide, not all of the population have an access to the digital. So that is why this digitalization have also an impact about the widespread of this income inequality. And the third issue, Alicia mentioned about this, when we go into digital, then there is a need for the reskilling and upskilling because this will require skill. Yeah, but unfortunately, some group of people who doesn't have enough capability, will be left out under this kind of situation. So the risk is there. Now the question is what the government can do. Uh, I mentioned to you earlier, that is why the future fiscal policy should focus on the issue of the inclusive growth. The first one is will provide the social security, especially for the poor people and the vulnerable groups. The second one will focus some allocate for funding for this reskilling and upskilling. Yeah, and then investment in infrastructure, digital infrastructure. So what's the role of the private sector here? I do believe that the private sector can play a role as well, especially on the issue of this reskilling and upskilling. The government can ask them, to give a training and give the double deduction of tax, that kind of model. And for the government side, the issue of financing is very important. And for this particular issue, I would like to, refresh my statement earlier. The government perhaps can sort of like come up with the funding by reduction the fossil fuel and use this money for the inclusive growth. And in addition to that, if they would like to support the vulnerable groups, they can come up with the program like the Cash Forward, and then focus this Cash Forward program for mangrove or the green project. So we can combine the benefit of this, towards green, climate change, at the same time to address the issue of poverty and inequality.
Thank you, Shatib. But we are unfortunately almost out of time, but Hoey, I'm going to let you have the final word here, just briefly, and talking about three things, and I know they're big topics, but regionalization, value change, and post-pandemic growth. Can you give us just some closing comments in just a couple of minutes on those topics?
Thank you, Glenn. Yeah, I think we have had a very rich discussion. I started off by saying that, we did a study because we wanted to see whether the growth strategy that the region has followed is still valid and effective. And I think, our view is that the growth strategy is still working, but it needs to be, there are some flaws and weaknesses, and it needs to be fixed. And one of the ways in which this can be done is through building greater, the pandemic has revealed, for instance, that the global supply chain, can be vulnerable to disruption, and we need to build greater resilience in order to strengthen the global supply chain. But that is, but the regionalization, it offers a way for us to address some of these issues, because in order to regionalize, you need to have rule-based. You need to be able to, make sure that everybody cooperates and follow the same rule. And so this is very important in view of the, the trend towards protectionism, populist policies. I think the region to stand up and make a stand and say that we are committed to rule-based trading system, and regionalization actually is a strength, is the way in which we can do that. And also, I think from my earlier comment, I think we come to realize that regionalization also offers, greater a boost to digitalization and allow countries to specialize even more, and and this will lead to greater productivity increase. So this is one of the great achievements of the region, the fact that we are able to regionalize and build on the global value chain. But I think the pandemic has also revealed that we also need to build a stronger social safety net to address the vulnerable groups, because we know that the shocks can come from anywhere. And of course, now we have the risk of the Ukraine crisis, casting a dark shadow over the region. And so we need to be prepared for that too. So let me stop here, and thank you all for participating in this webinar.
We've come to the end of our time today, ladies and gentlemen, but special thanks to Ho-Yi, Ling Hui, Alicia, and Shatib for your insights today. And all of you who are watching, please do remember to go to AMRO's website and download the ASEAN+3 Regional Economic Outlook for 2022. We'd like to hear your thoughts on the discussion, and please go to the survey link or scan the QR code that's going to be shown at the end of this broadcast, and do give your feedback. Well, thank you for tuning in and for your participation and questions. I'm Glenn Van Zutphen. We'll see you all at our next AMRO event.